Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a Q&A episode, and I have three questions I'm going to dive into. But first, before I go into that, I just want to go over my free body recomp checklist. And so with that, I go over 10 things you need for body recomp, but I also touch on the two different types of body recomp, what body recomp is, and the importance of focusing on your body composition instead of just weight loss. So again, that's completely free. It's in the show notes. So go make sure you check that out. So let's dive into today's question. So my first question is around how long are training cycles for muscle growth? I think it is super important to clarify, what are we trying to do? Is muscle growth strength, or is it more muscle growth? Are you strength? Is it more strength focused? Is it a running? What are you trying to focus on specifically? And again, most people I work with are going to be, we want to be focused on hypertrophy. We want to build some muscle. So those are how most programs are going to be based off of. And this is a common question of how long should I stick with the same workouts? And the reason I think training cycles matter is because training and structure cycles is going to be just random weekly workouts. That's one of the big things that I want to work on with new clients is, and things that I feel like people struggle with is when it comes to muscle growth, we can be random, but when we're random, it just makes things, you don't really know if you're progressing or not. So you're just guessing. And that's where people are not sure on if they're progressing or not inside their workouts. And with muscle growth being super slow, it is hard to see that on there. And then if you're questioning what you're doing, you don't know if you're progressing from a strength standpoint, you can see where that's confusing. So I feel like training and structured cycles is going to be weekly random workouts. That's kind of my biggest harp on like things like group classes. If somebody is trying to change their body composition and they get stuck, one of the easy things is, are your workouts the same from week to week? And if the answer is no, it's like, that's probably a good place to start, because when things are random, then again, we don't know if they're progressing or not. And a lot of it comes down to, oh, I get bored, I need to switch things up. And I do think there's this happy medium of, I'm always trying to play that game with clients of, hey, let's switch things up there. What I will say is I'm a little bit more, in the past, it was very like, hey, let's stay in this phase for X amount of time, 6 weeks, and then we'll change it up. Whereas now I'm a little bit more liberal in terms of how long we're going to be in a training cycle and maybe some of the changes we make, but I'll talk about there. But I think the big thing is we do want to get some sort of structure with your training. And obviously it needs to match up with what are the long-term goals, what are the things we're working on over this next 6 to 12 months. But as I said, for most of my clients, it is body composition and focusing on adding some muscle, and how can we get the most out of that process. And so the programming is fairly straightforward. Now, once you get into, maybe you have separate goals that you want to focus on, right? Maybe you're someone who's, hey, eventually I want to run more marathons and I want to focus on that. Then you do have to have a little bit more periodization with your training. Maybe have some sort of powerlifting competition. Again, you would need to be a little bit more structured with your periodization. Whereas if we are really just trying to build muscle, we don't necessarily need to have this, oh, hey, we have to do a 6-week block of this, a 6-week block of that. I guess one thing that would be different is if somebody does want to have there's a couple changes where you could make with how long the training cycle is. So nutrition periodization, if somebody has a good amount of muscle, they're going to go through a pretty good size deficit and a fair, their fat loss phase is going to be fairly long. I think for them, it makes sense to, hey, we may need to periodize in terms of how much volume we're doing. You may decrease frequency. You may decrease how many days you're working out. You may decrease the volume you're doing. Like that would be one thing. Changing goals in terms of maybe you're not overly, you want to have a muscle building phase where you're really focused on maximizing muscle as much as possible. Then maybe again, you're going to do a bit more volume overall, maybe more training days. And then you have more of a maintenance type phase. Again, I don't like the word maintenance because I think no matter what, we still want to be trying to move forward. But again, maybe it is hey, I'm not focused on maximizing muscle as much. Then maybe we decrease frequency, decrease volume a bit. And that would be within that goal of how we would potentially periodize our training and how that would allow for different weeks of how long in a training cycle you would be. But another one would be for people that are, maybe the people that I would work with specifically would be, maybe your goal is you need to work on your conditioning a bit more. Then that may be a thing, and you already have a good amount of muscle. Maybe that's a thing where we back off the volume for weightlifting and how many days you're doing, and maybe we increase our volume for our conditioning for a short period of time, for a short block. And then you go into another block where now you have better conditioning overall, and then now you go into a heavy muscle growth phase there. And then that would lead to more volume that you would be doing the lifting side. So those would be some things that would alter how we would adjust training in terms of like periodization. If your goal is like body composition, overall health there, right? Now, again, as we get more specific you have specific goals for something, then you might need to be a little bit more structured with your periodization. But those would be some things that would slightly change in terms of like volume from one cycle to the next and what that looks like there. But you don't need, if your goal is muscle growth, you don't necessarily really need any sort of periodization scheme where you do, oh, this phase here, then that phase, right? I feel like you can stay fairly consistent. Again, I'll talk about some changes that I'll make from training training cycle, but to me, you don't need to have okay, hey, 6 months, this cycle needs to be this, and then this cycle needs to be that. It can mostly just be, hey, we're trying to build muscle, and that needs to be our sole focus. So we need to do the things that are going to lead to adding muscle. And as I said, there's some goals in there of where you're at from a nutrition periodization standpoint, your energy availability, how many calories you're eating. And then obviously if you have more like conditioning type goals or other type goals that would change that. But really, why do training cycles matter? So as I talk about, training and structured cycles beats random weekly workouts, right? But muscle growth also takes time. So early changes from new exercises are going to mostly be neurological and not like muscle growth. It takes a couple weeks for your body to get used to a new exercise. There's been so many times where I've had clients do a new exercise and maybe it doesn't feel great the first time, but then you do it a couple times, you're like, okay, now this feels pretty good. But if we're constantly changing, we're always just having to learn that new exercise, and your body's spending more time learning the exercise than it is actually building muscle and being like, okay, hey, we need to add muscle. So we have to take that in consideration if we're changing things up every single week. And then obviously if you take a leg extension versus a back squat, it's okay, back squat's probably going to take a little bit more skill development. It's going to take a little bit more time for your body to learn, whereas a leg extension, it's pretty self-explanatory. But in saying that, I do think even within 1 week, it takes a little bit of time to get it dialed in, to really get it dialed in there. Hey, what's the right amount of weight? How do I need to have the seat set up to really maximize tension on my quad? So some of that takes time. And so constantly changing exercises means you're always learning movements instead of progressing. And it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks to dial in new movements and then field them properly, right? If we're constantly changing, that's going to be problematic there. And then once setup and execution are consistent, it's easier to track progress and train harder. Once you have that in, it's like, now you know how to get it set up. That's super effective. And then you can just get straight to work, right? And really push that muscle close to failure there. And so again, with the exercises, staying consistent, it's going to allow for progressive overload and measurable progress. We're going to know what we need to increase there. And then changing early exercises, and then obviously changing the order of the exercise. So if you're doing different exercises and you're changing the order and it's completely different, it's going to impact what you can do later in that session. Again, it's hard to know if you're progressively overloading, right? Let's say you had it set up where in your one workout for the week, you had your leg press is the first one. And then the next week you wanted to try a new workout, and now you had back squats, leg extensions, lunges before. Now you do leg press fourth or fifth. Well, that's going to dramatically change what you can do. So that can make it confusing. And so the familiarity improves setup, load selection, and performance, and you know what to expect there. And I think even from a mental load perspective, it takes some pressure off of that. Now, in saying that, though, you can't progress forever with the same setup. I definitely think overuse or boredom can set in for a lot of clients. Like I said, we're trying to watch that happy medium there. Okay, we don't want to change things up super frequently, but at some point, overuse can set in, boredom can set in, plus exercises can get stale, or they can cause minor overuse injuries over time. I'm sure you've done an exercise for a while and it's felt great, and then slowly over time, it started to not feel as great there. And then even from a psychological perspective, just that refresh matters. Changing rep ranges, exercise variation really does help with motivation. We've all been there, right? You've hammered out a training cycle for extended periods of time, and at the end, it's okay, this workout was super motivating, and now it's like, I really don't want to go. And I think from a mental perspective, if we're not mentally ready to go and wanting to do that workout, you may not put everything into it that you could. And then training variety keeps intensity high, and it can prevent plateaus when we're doing things slightly different when we change it up over time. So some novelty is definitely good, and we definitely want to have that. I don't think we need to. Some people be like, oh, you should just keep the same exercises forever and you should never change them. And I think that's a bit ridiculous. I don't think we need to do that, because again, we can't ignore the psychological side of things. When we look at this, what does that kind of lead to in terms of how long your cycle should be? Because that was the original question. I think it should be about 6 to 12 weeks. There's no one size fits all timeline. I think if we can push cycles closer to 8 to 12 weeks where we really keep things mostly the same, it's really going to allow for deeper adaptation and better progress. Shorter phases can make sense. Let's say you fall under that kind of 6 to 12 weeks, you fall in that 4 to 6, can make sense if one, like less life stress or fatigue is high. If there's something that comes up in your life, it doesn't make sense to keep pushing that training cycle. Oh, hey, we said it's going to be 6 to 12 weeks. We have to stick to it. But hey, you had some sort of life stress come up. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you got more work or whatever it may be. It might make sense to maybe cycle out of that training cycle or take a temporary reduction in, say, your intensity or volume or whatever it may be. So we definitely want to look at that. And then maybe fatigue is just high. Maybe you're just under recovered for whatever reason. Maybe you push too close to failure early. And so like now in week 6, it's like you're just really feeling the effects of pushing really hard right away. That would be something that may warrant. Maybe we need to readjust, lower intensity for a little, and then refresh in terms of maybe we need to back off that intensity early in a training cycle. There, we don't need to go balls to the wall right away. And then maybe you're dealing with a minor injury or travel or some sort of schedule change there. So maybe you have a minor injury. That's definitely a sign that we would want to switch things up a little bit. Maybe some travel came up. Does it make sense to be like, hey, I'm in week 4 of this training cycle. I say that has to be 6 to 12 weeks. I'm just going to keep pushing through. That leads to injury. We do want to be somewhat flexible on that. And then again, any sort of schedule change you have as well too. I think longer phases, if we can push it and we can stick with the same thing for extended periods of time, and again, we have that drive, like we are progressing in them and you're still pushing yourself. I definitely think longer phases, 10 to 12 weeks, are going to be good when if you're consistent, recovery is solid, you're progressing, and you aren't really showing signs of a ton of fatigue that is causing you to maybe not push yourself as hard. So that's where a longer cycle is going to be better. So I've definitely, since I've started coaching, my philosophy was, again, in this like 4 to 6 week time frame, and then I'm always constantly switching it up. But I have this flexible auto-regulated approach now where if things are going well, we're not going to switch it up. I'm always checking in, making sure you're feeling good. But if things are going well, like to me, there's no point in switching things up and changing a training cycle because you feel like you need to be at whatever phase. But what I will say is I do think people that are newer to training, they could probably go longer with their training cycles, staying with the same program there. And then, whereas people who are maybe a bit more advanced, like it would be a little bit harder to stick with the same kind of training for extended periods of time. Again, if you're getting to week 4 to 6 and you're feeling like you're just super beat up and you constantly need to change your training after 4 to 6 weeks, I would look at, is your recovery there? What's your exercise selection? Maybe we need to make some adjustment from a programming perspective and intensity perspective if you're consistently running into that issue there. Or do you feel like you need to, and then even from a mental standpoint, right? Like that is always a thing. It's like, okay, yes, we want training to be fun, but do you maybe need to understand that, hey, if you want to build more muscle and you want to really push that, then you might have to sacrifice a little bit of quote unquote funness with your training. We never want training to be super boring. I don't think that's helpful for anybody there. What I will say on this though is I'm definitely more open to making small changes within a training cycle, right? Like maybe there's a muscle group that you're not overly concerned about. You just want to check the boxes for that muscle group. Then maybe it is, hey, we make a small change in terms of exercise selection for an exercise, right? Being a bit more flexible with that, I think, is key. And that's not going to necessarily derail your entire training program there. What I will say though is I do think that it's probably a good idea to every once in a while take a phase where you just back off intensity, volume, whatever it may be. Like have a week where you do back off a bit. Or again, maybe it's, hey, after I've been doing a training cycle for 6 to 12 weeks, things are going fairly well, but maybe I'm starting to feel a little bit burnt out. Maybe I am going to make some small changes, but I'm also going to decrease my intensity a little bit. Instead of doing 1 to 2 RIR, maybe I'm going to do 3 to 4 RIR for 1 week, right? You're still getting in productive training, but you're not going as hard there, right? And that can take some stress it can take a psychological load off of your body and physiological as well too, from just pushing your body there. So I'm like less likely to give people a quote unquote deload week now, unless they really freaking need one. But again, if that's the case, if people constantly need deloads, then to me, it's stressors somewhere else that need to be dialed in versus it being a training issue per se. But as I said, sometimes people just need that for a mental reset. They need it for travel, whatever it is, right? Like maybe it's a week where you're traveling. So let's just take a lighter week. You don't necessarily need to go balls to the wall with that. So it could look something like, let's say you don't need to necessarily take a full on deload. You can do something like 8 to 12 weeks of a training cycle. Then you do a reset week, a little bit lighter intensity. Maybe you make some changes to your program, and then you start to ramp things back up. So again, align the transition with life events. And then if you know that you have a life event come up, a little shorter blocks, let's say, hey, in 6 weeks, I'm going to be traveling. All right, let's training block for 6 weeks. You're probably going to be pushing it a bit more, right? Some changes that I would make would be like, maybe very rarely am I just completely overhauling a client's program from one phase to the next. That's usually some small changes, right? Like some changes you can make would be swap a few exercises, keep 70-80% of it the same, but make some changes ones that really are not feeling good for you. And again, these are typical changes that I'll make within a client's training cycle. Change the rep ranges, 6 to 10 reps to 10 to 15, right? Make some small rep changes. Are these things, do you have to do these things to build muscle? No, but it can be good to get a little bit of variety in there. Again, depending on the situation and what the exercise is. Maybe it's adjusting the set structure. Maybe we're going to do a little bit more superset on some exercise. Maybe we're going to add in a little bit more rest pause on some things. Another thing that I'll typically do is change the focus of the session. So maybe day 1 was more it was upper and it was chest like push focus for day one, and then your second upper of the day was more back focus. Maybe we're going to flip flop that, and now back focus is going to be number one there. Right? Or again, if there's been a muscle group that's been getting bumped to later in the exercise in the workouts, then maybe they get bumped up there. Or maybe even small form tweaks. So instead of doing bilateral, maybe we switch to single leg version. Maybe we work on slightly different tempo. Maybe we change the range of motion. Maybe it's a grip thing. There's just small changes that we can make that can really make you make a couple changes and it's still somewhat of the same program, but there are some small changes that keep it fresh for people. I think in terms of how long to keep an exercise, I think you want to keep it as long as it feels good and it's progressing. If it's causing discomfort, stale, or unmotivating after, you've been doing it for 2 to 3 cycles, probably time to switch it up. But there's really no need to replace every exercise at once. I think small rotations are enough to really milk out those gains on certain muscle exercises, but then also to keep things fresh over time there. So again, I think to sum this up, most training cycles are going to be 6 to 12 weeks for most training cycles. Again, like I said, I'm a bit more flexible in terms of how exactly we go about that now, where it was in the past very rigid of 6 weeks, we're changing things up. And again, I'm going to adjust it based on recovery, lifestyle, and progress there. And again, we don't want to overthink timelines. Listen to your body, stay consistent with the principles of building muscle, and those are going to be the most important there. So another thing I want to go over is I had somebody who's kind of asked, clients have been asking me like clients, and then I've gotten questions from people too about like factors that impact training performance, right? So it's like, hey, you go into the gym, it's like you were doing something, and then the next week you go in and it's like you weren't able to match that at all. Or maybe even you had a couple bad training sessions in a row, or maybe you just had one bad training session. I think a lot of times when that happens, they feel like they need to make some sort of adjustment with what they're doing. Oh, I need to change my calories. Oh, I need to change my workout. When rarely it's probably something that happened that is causing a fluctuation in your performance, right? So these would be things that if you didn't have a good session, I would check through. And these are things that when clients say they don't have a good session, I am going through them with them to see. So factors are going to impact training performance. So hydration, right? So even mild dehydration can decrease performance, increase fatigue, and it makes training feel harder. Definitely check your hydration status. If you switch from evenings to mornings, that could definitely be something. And then if you just haven't been drinking as much water or fluids in general, right? It doesn't have to just be water. That could definitely be something there. Look at the exercise and workout order. So changing exercise sequence or the day you train, for example, lower before upper or like post rest day or whatever it may be. Again, where you do the workout in the week could alter your performance potentially in terms of the order of the workout and everything like that. So we obviously want to try and keep training order consistent for the most accurate comparisons from week to week. But if you have to change it up, just understand that it's going to impact the recovery timeline on things. If you typically have a lower day and then a rest day, and then you do upper, and then you do lower upper, that could impact your performance the next day there. So you just need to see. And then obviously in combination with all these things. Equipment variation. So a lot of times clients aren't aware that, okay, did you do a different lat pull down? Yep, did a different lat pull down machine. That's going to make a massive difference. Machines vary from machine to machine. Even though a leg press is a leg press, they're not the same. They can be completely different in terms of their resistance profile, where it's hardest at, the setup. All these things can make it completely different. So different machines or cable stacks are going to change loading mechanics and resistance. So if we want to have the most accurate representation from a weight perspective, we want to keep the equipment the same as much as possible there. This is where I think RIR training can be helpful because it does help you with that. But to go back to what we talked about with the skill development, even though it is a leg press, like it could be different. And so that is going to alter your number there. Your nutrition and energy balance. So pre-workout meals and total calories are going to strongly influence performance. So if you have changes in carb intake or training fasted versus fed, this is going to alter your energy and strength. And then being in a calorie deficit can make workouts feel tougher. It's typically going to be workouts just feel tougher. You're going to fatigue quicker, but especially on things that require longer duration and higher volume, you'll start to see things like you're not going to be able to go as hard for as long. All that's going to be. So that's kind of why in a deficit, I'm a bigger fan of like lower volume, lower rep work versus like super high volume and like super high rep ranges in a deficit. Stress load is going to be huge. So psychological or emotional stress can lower strength and focus. And then obviously like mental demanding tasks before training can reduce performance. And then total stress on the body is going to compound and that's going to lead to some fatigue, right? If you're under a bit more stress lately and or your body's under more stress, or even from a mental standpoint, you had more stress before, like that's going to impact your performance potentially. Again, training fatigue and periodization. So going too hard early in a training block can lead to fatigue later on. So again, what you've been doing the last couple of weeks of training is going to impact how ready your body is. And then obviously if things are off in terms of higher stress load, nutrition hasn't been as great, that's going to impact your performance on there and acutely and long-term. In the long term, it's more so it all adds up. Whereas in the short term, these would be some things that would happen in the short term. Sleep quality, right? So if you're not getting good sleep, if you didn't get a good night's sleep from the night before, that could be something that is going to impact your performance. What I have personally found is if I get a really bad night of sleep, that next day, if it's one night, the next day, training is you feel a bit more fatigued, but you go in and have a session, you almost feel better. Where it starts to add up is when you have multiple nights of not great sleep, that then it starts to accumulate, and that's where you really feel like performance decrease there. The menstrual cycle for females. So typically the week before bleeding, that luteal phase often brings reduced energy, motivation, and strength. It's not a reason to change programming. I don't think we need to have a preset like, oh, this is typically when your luteal phase is. It's the week before you bleed. Hey, we need to not do any training. Like, I don't think you need to be that rigid with it, but you may need to auto-regulate and understand that your training might feel a little bit tougher. Alcohol consumption, especially the night before, is going to impair recovery and can decrease training output. Look at that. Did you have even just one glass of wine could impact it? Rest times between sets could alter your performance in numbers that you can hit. So shorter rest is you're likely not going to have as good of strength performance. So your numbers could potentially decrease. We want to try to keep rest intervals consistent across sessions. Your training, your environment, right? Training environment, home versus busy gym is going to affect motivation and focus. You do want to find things that do help you from a environment standpoint. So if you did something in the gym, not only is the equipment different and then you do it at home, maybe you're not as motivated to train at home. Like that is probably going to alter what you can do. If you're trying to keep up with other people in the gym, or maybe you see someone that you find attractive and you're like, oh, I'm freaking ready to, that can impact it there. Technique improvement. So better form can temporarily lower numbers but it's progress and quality in muscle recruitment, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we do alter our technique and make it better and that allows for more tension on the target muscle, you're probably going to see your numbers decrease, and that's not a bad thing. Motivation and mental state. So low motivation, boredom, lack of novelty can all reduce intensity and effort. So we talked about that. If you're having a day where stress is high, typically I find that motivation's lower. That's going to impact what you can do. How you feel about your workout going in is gonna impact your ability to perform. Some people, it is a matter of you need to push through. But again, if you're constantly finding that motivation is low, like to me, you have someone that their motivation is constantly low versus someone whose motivation is medium and they feel relatively good more times than not to go train. That person's going to have better results than the person that has lower motivation. So at that point, it would be like, okay, in the short term, it can definitely impact it. Long term, if that keeps happening, we need to see what is the reason that's happening. And then sometimes you just need to recognize when to reset. Some occasional off days are normal. Like you're going to just have some sessions where maybe these things aren't off and you just didn't have a good day. It's not a big deal. It's again, what we do over time there. But if it starts happening multiple times per week or across several weeks, we do need to look at things a bit more and see if we can make any adjustments from a training perspective or recovery standpoint. But again, you have one day where some of these are off. Maybe you missed your pre-workout meals. Oh, okay. Now I know that does impact my performance. And so next time that happens, you can go into it. Okay, maybe I'm not going to have a super demanding leg workout if I skip my pre-workout meal. Maybe it's going to be more upper body that day. Or now you know, hey, it's important that I do get my pre-workout meal because it does impact my training performance there. So hopefully that was helpful. If that gives you guys some insights into what can impact your performance, and then what is like one session where you don't have a good session is not problematic. That's, hey, I'm just going to double check things and see if they're off. Now they start to happen more regularly. Is it a recovery problem? Now I need to look into things a bit more here from that perspective. All right. Somebody asked, how long does it take to feel creatine? So creatine is interesting in that you're not going to necessarily feel creatine. It's not like caffeine where you take it and then 10 minutes later or an hour later or whatever, you're buzzing and you feel great. Creatine is a little bit more under the radar in a way, right? It's not really noticeable, but it's just one of those things that it's 2 to 3% improvement consistently adds up over time there. Now, so you're not necessarily ever going to feel it. However, if we want to get the benefits of creatine right away and you haven't been taking it, loading is still probably going to be the best way to saturate the muscles. That is the best way to saturate your muscles as quickly as possible for the performance benefits. There's obviously some issues with GI distress, things like that. But if you just take it consistently, you're going to get there eventually. But if you want to get that little bit of extra 1% earlier, again, what's that going to add up over a year in terms of progress? Very minimal, not even noticeable, but that is a way to get things going and reaping the benefits of creatine a lot sooner there. What I will say on this though is sleep deprivation might be the only thing though that you would benefit acutely from taking a high dose of creatine. There's been some studies where when someone was sleep deprived and they took creatine, I think it was up to 20 grams a day, their cognitive function was, I don't know if it was the same or it was improved or what it was. Obviously wasn't improved over regular, but you may not have seen as large of a detriment in terms of cognitive function and whatnot there. But that does seem to be a time where you could acutely you could get an acute benefit from high dose, like from creatine specifically there. So something to look out for. Now, obviously, with 20 grams of creatine, there's a high risk of GI distress and things like that. So you need to look out for that. But that would be the only time you would have something that would be concrete from a, or that you would notice acutely. And again, I still feel like some of those things from a cognitive standpoint, it's under the radar, right? Like you don't necessarily ever notice it, but it's just under the radar type thing that is going to benefit from you or benefit you in the long term there. But again, it's never going to be something that you feel, right? It's not going to be something like beta alanine where you take a ton of it and you get those tingles. It's just, that's not how creatine works there. So hopefully that was helpful. That's it for today's episode. A bunch of questions or good questions, deep dive into two of them. Hopefully that gives you more insight on creatine. That's it for this episode. If you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that will help more people find it. And then follow me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN _. That's where I'm most active. If you want to reach out to me, you have any questions on the podcast, definitely give me a follow there. And I will say hi to you. Don't be shy and expect a message from me if you do follow me. Hopefully that doesn't deter anyone, but I will say hi to you if you do follow me. That's it for now. I'll talk to you guys soon.